Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about where I think the meta might be evolving into as we go into the national season, where I think Dash will end up, and overall where I think the meta is going to land. Now, this is just simply my opinion. I'm only working solo on this. I'm just mostly working off what I know, hearing from other very experienced players, my own local group who are also very good at the game, and just myself, my own personal experience, and a few of my thoughts. So specifically, we'll start with Dash. So it's probably no secret that Dash has actually had like a bit of a breakout recently. Between the top 8 of the Battle Hardened in Columbus, the top 8 of the Battle Hardened in Portland, we had a winning list at the Calling in Singapore, and we also had a top 8 at the Pro Tour in Lille. So at this point, it does seem that Dash is actually pretty strong right now, at least in terms of being sort of a rogue deck that's always kind of existed in Tier 2. During the Everfest season, even into ProQuest Season 2, we didn't really see too much success from Dash in terms of competitive viability, but it seems like it's a bit different now. So I guess the question is, well, what changed first of all? I think there's a couple things. I think people forgot what the hero did, honestly. There were a lot of people who were asking me how to beat Dash after she had won the Calling in Singapore. And that was really interesting, right? To be asked like, how do I beat this? I think that went to show that a lot of people weren't really prepared for the deck. A lot of people didn't know about the more recent iterations to the deck, which was more of like the hybrid build that could flex in between an aggro build and a pistol one. It seemed like it preyed a lot on people's inexperience with the deck. At least being all in on like Talishar and no high octane, it did seem a little bit susceptible to fatigue in the aggro matchups it was trying to beat, but a lot of people just weren't even trying to block it. They were simply trying to race, and I think that was, of course, to the benefit of Dash and the pilot for Dash. I think as Dash spends more time in the spotlight, I do think the deck will begin to suffer a little bit as people then start to learn how to counteract the strategy. I know Guardians have always had to find plans for Dash in terms of the pistol build, because the pistol build has traditionally been very strong into Guardians. But I do know that even heroes like Oldhim are now adjusting game plans to beat these new versions of Dash. I think that's definitely a problem for Dash, and I think she's in the best spot when people don't know about her. When people forget that Dash is a hero, I think that's when she can break out the most because of that sort of surprise factor. I think she loses a lot of her strength as the deck is more well known. In terms of even the aggro build, I mean, we saw in the top 8 Dash losing to Fatigue at the Pro Tour, right, against a Briar, which is crazy. But also not that crazy if you know a lot about the deck. You do know it is very susceptible to fatiguing if you full block it. If you're not running Induction Chamber and you're starting with Teklo Pounder, then your late game damage as you hit your blue stack is actually very difficult to push through. Even if you had the +6 from the Teklo Pounder during the first 3 turns of the game, you get the +2 3 turns in a row. You still have the problem of not being able to close it out, and the 6 damage early game isn't really worth it. But the problem is that, like, if the other aggro player doesn't know that, then they can try to race you and they'll probably lose. But now that everyone knows that the deck is here, people are playtesting it, trying to figure out how to beat it, and I think that it's going to get significantly weaker as time goes on. However, Prism leaving does open up some interesting questions about what the meta is even going to evolve into. More specifically, we can look at the Battle Hardened in Columbus, and yeah, it's crazy, right? Because it's just all ice heroes. So, you know, maybe that should be expected. And it's not surprising here that Dash actually did pretty well, even though Dash actually had to beat, I actually think, a few kind of difficult matchups, at least ones that are more skill intensive. So Dromai and Icelander, I think, are pretty tough for Dash in terms of if the other player knows what they're doing and you don't really know exactly what you're doing, I think you'll just end up losing those matchups most of the time. I think we're entering like a pretty skill-based meta where pitch stacking second cycle is going to be important. I think a lot of mid-range heroes now kind of exist between Icelander, Dash, Dromai, and even arguably Oldhim. So I think it really is going to be knowing how to maximize value out of your cards, maximize value out of your hand, both on offense and defense. I think that you'll be winning most of your games that way. So look at the top 8, Columbus. I think that Boost Dash would have a problem into pretty much most of this. I think Dromai has a very easy time fatiguing it with all the concentration of 3 blocks between the invokes, the armor, as well as defense reactions like Sink Below, Fate Foreseen. Even cards like Sigil can start to bolster up the life total. I will make the exception that I think Dromai is a very hard hero to pin down. It feels like every time I talk about Dromai with people, there's always like a difference in experience with the hero. Some people are like, oh yeah, she's really crazy. She just plays like rainbow rakes, right? She plays all the reds, all the yellows, all the blues. She makes like a million Ashwing tokens and kills you. And I'm like, that's never happened to me before, right? Like maybe one time they'll like resolve like red rake against me. But like my experience with the deck is like, oh my god, I like can't beat them because they just full block. And then they just like pitch stack the most insane dragon lineup. And then they just like explode out in the end game. Or like I can't beat Azulai because he's a 0 for 6. So yeah, I think Dromai is a hard hero to pin down. I've noticed there's a very big difference in how people play the hero. So I'm not sure if we exactly know what the signature Dromai game plan is at this point. At least it's not obvious to me, right? So Dromai almost feels like Dash in that sense, where it's like this mid-range deck that, unless if you're in the know about it and you're actively piloting it, it does seem a little, I guess it's a little vague to other players, which is to your benefit as a Dromai player, because you know what to capitalize on and you know when the other person makes a mistake, right? Like with Dash, when someone lets Combustible Courier hit, usually it's pretty obvious to me the person doesn't know a whole lot about the hero, or I'm dead, right? Because like Combustible Courier is the one mech card that actually has an on hit, so it's the only one that you would actively want to block to deny additional damage, right? But if someone doesn't know that, like red Combustible Courier is essentially like letting a red Moth Skies hit, which most of the time you normally don't let that happen. Unless if once again they're dead on the next turn and it doesn't matter. When that happens, I'm like, okay, maybe this person doesn't know too much about the dash list, right? They might think there's an even better on hit in the deck, and I'm like, no, this is it. This is the only on hit she has. Like red high speed impact, like who cares? Like dominate on my 5 attack, okay. So that's where the mentioning too, right? In that sense, Dromai is definitely gonna have a lot of strength, I think, in the coming meta, just because people are gonna have to learn what she does, and it's harder to interact with that board state. Because with Dash, if she plays pistols, it's like, okay, well, great, you can't do anything about it anyway. But you know, it gets harder when you have to start doing like evaluation of the table and be like, oh, which dragon's like the best one to kill? Is it worth it to throw 2 attacks in a Yendurai to kill it through the endurance counter? Do I throw a full 6 attack at it? How fast should I clear Chromai off the table? And the answer is always immediately. But like sometimes it's not obvious to people. And so then on to Icelander, like Icelander is very strong, has had a lot of success recently. She is definitely going to have a much easier time without Prism existing in the meta. She still has some of the tougher matchups that still exist there, but she's just a fantastic mid-range hero that I think is really gated behind player skill. I think she's pretty tough in the sense that you have to know how to disrupt your opponent and still be able to basically keep 1 card a turn. So you have to work with 3 cards. You normally have to pitch 1 every single turn. Sometimes, not all the time, right? So that's the difficulty. Sometimes it is correct just to block with like Frost Hexes, and sometimes it's not. Most of the time it's kind of easy because it's matchup dependent, but I think she's pretty tough. I would not feel comfortable just like randomly picking her up for an armory. I think, or okay, for an armory, yes, but definitely not for something like Nats or Worlds. Like the night before, being like, okay, yeah, cool, I'll play Icelander tomorrow. Like absolutely not. Like I would need so many reps on that deck, or I would need to lose to it so many times that I feel like I know how to beat people on it. So, and then of course they have Oldhim. I think Oldhim is actually starting to tech for Dash, and I think that Oldhim is going to be a tougher matchup than people maybe are anticipating. I think that the Rampart's the problem, right? Because every time you reload the pistol, the chain closes, so Rampart is able to essentially reblock and then gain an additional point of block value. So what that means is like early game you're not doing a lot of damage with pistol, plus Induction Chamber, you are able to actually use that to your benefit. Early game into Oldhim, you're able to pistol, give it go again. They're gonna Crown and Rampart, expecting to reblock with the Rampart, and then you can display an attack without boosting. So you can play like red zipper hit, red 0 to 60, like throttle, any of these like solid cards that are still going to be in your deck. And their Rampart's still on the first combat chain, so then they either have to take damage to throw an aggressive attack back at you, or they have to block down to, at that point, usually about 1 card, which is then the difference between arsenaling for Crown on the following turn or throwing Winter's Wail back at you. Now that won't always happen, obviously, but that is a way you can sort of navigate that. And then of course you do have the end game of the same thing. You assemble the pistol engine and it still leaks damage through once you assemble all 4. So 2 induction chambers and 2 plasma purifiers. I believe you leak 5 damage a turn if they were to just pitch into Crown and Rampart the whole time. So they still eventually have to start blocking with cards and eventually they just die. But it is tough because Rampart extends the game a lot longer than it would into Bravo. Bravo does have the ability to be more aggressive than Oldhim, just naturally, especially having Dominate built in, so they can both still give you a hard time. I still think you're favored into both if you build your deck correctly. But that is part of the problem with the hybrid builds, is that I actually feel like they're a little bit weaker to Guardian than they traditionally would be. If now Guardians no longer having the Prism matchup, really only have to care about how polarizing Dash can feel, or maybe Icelander, you're going to start seeing a much more aggressive builds that I think will actually give the hybrid builds problems. To go back into the Rune Blades really quick, because they're also a very, very significant part of the meta, I think Briar is probably shaping up to probably be like one of the best decks to probably be on during the upcoming Nats and World season, unless if something changes, is probably just the full boost, right? The hybrid build is fine. It works very well. You're able to not consistently win into Runeblade, but you are much more favored than you would be on a traditional mid-range build where you're going to be playing cards like Tome, CNC, and you're trying to like pitch stack to the second cycle while setting up items. It's normally very difficult to be aggressive in that version of the deck because you run generics, and it's a very serious problem, especially if you're relying on Achilles Accelerator being your AB for the matchup. I think you just naturally have a really hard time. So even through Runeblade's trying to fatigue you, there are ways to beat it. So the way that I personally have sort of circumnavigated the problem that's now surfaced is you just start Induction Chamber instead of a Purifier, or no, sorry, instead of Pounder. And that's like really all you have to do, because once you hit second cycle and you're in that full blue pitch stack and your opponent's like at 4 life or something and you just really need to close out the game, you're able to basically leak damage every turn with Induction Chamber plus whatever else you're boosting. And then late game, when you're down to just all blues and you have to like clear out the game, it's what gets you there. So I think it's really important. I think it fixes your fatigue problem. That's all you have to do. And this is assuming that the Rune Blades are just trying to full block the whole game, or Briar's trying to go down to 1 card, throw an attack at you to get an Earth Embodiment, and then block with all of her non-attacks during your turn, and then repeat this process. I think that Induction Chamber fixes your issue. Of course, it does include the problem that if they decide to then see that and then just try racing you, you do lose a little bit of your pressure. So I think either way, I think you're going to have a hard time in Rune Blades. They're just clearly a better aggro class than you are. They're a better mid-range class than you are. Sorry, if you get a problem with it, take it over to LSS, not me. So yeah. So let's actually move on to a tier list. I hate doing these. I specifically do not do them, but times are tough, and YouTube content does not come easily, so here we are. So boom, look at that, you're welcome, here's the tier list. And guess what, it's not going to be a joke this time. It's not going to be a meme tier list, so, or it still could be, who knows, maybe I have some really bad takes and it essentially is a meme tier list, so we might get lucky here, we might strike gold. And also, I think it might be important to actually clarify how I'm kind of approaching the tier list. So things that are going to be higher in the tier list are things I think are overall well positioned in the meta, or at least if they have a polarizing matchup, their polarizing matchup is also not well represented within the meta. So for instance, to go back to like the old ProQuest season, or even the old Pro season, Prism had like a pretty bad Rhinar matchup, because Prism had a pretty tough Rhinar matchup. Rhinar was able to gain a lot of action points naturally if they needed to, if they actually had to clear out multiple auras in a turn, and literally Prism was never able to resolve a Herald against them. And that matchup felt pretty bad for Prism. I'm not sure if I would say exactly polarizing, like it was unwinnable, but it was pretty unfavorable, right? But the thing was that Reinhardt was like tier 3 at least, even then. So no Prism player was like concerned about bringing Prism to a high level event because of the existence of Reinhardt. It was just too low in the meta. The same thing went for Azalea. From my understanding, Azalea actually had game into the Runeblades during the Scaletta season. She had a lot of cards that could actively pinpoint a lot of weaknesses within Runeblade. Probably not as well as Lexi, but still significant. But she was still considered the worst hero because, first of all, she couldn't consistently pull off that game plan because her cards are a bit weaker, but also because she just sucked into everyone else, unfortunately. It's still the case, surprise. But I think that can really influence it. So things that are higher on the tier list are things that are either well-positioned or don't have polarizing matchups that are also well-positioned. For instance, like a Runeblade would not consider themselves like less than tier 1 because of the existence of Azalea, right? Because the deck is just not very strong. So I'm going to keep you all in suspense. I'm actually going to save Dash for last, so too bad. I think that Kano is going to suffer. This as soon as people are expecting Wizards, they're going to bring AB. I think Kano is a really sick meta call into Pro Tour 1. A lot of people were going to be hedging a lot of their sideboards against Starvo. I know I personally was on Dash. I remember for the ProQuest Season 1, I was in between whether or not to run Iron Rock Gauntlet. Oh no, sorry. 1 yellow and movable, or run Visitronic Model I, which was crazy because I was like, if I don't run Visitronic Model I think I just lose to Wizard. But I feel like I need to beat Starvo so bad that I actually just have to cut it for this yellow and movable. It was just like a one of, right? So a lot of people were really hedging their sideboards against Starvo and a lot of other decks in that meta, and they just actually weren't able to bring Arcane Barrier. I mean, and Dash had the easiest access to Arcane Barrier. Your boots naturally have them built in, and Visitronic Model I was AB2. But if you look at a lot of other decks, they actually have to bring like 3 Null Rune, and that was just like impossible to do because Starvo was so taxing on what you needed to bring that I think that it was awesome, right? But since he's gone, and since Icelander is not popular, you're gonna find a lot of issues. People are gonna be naturally bringing Arcane Barrier, and not only people are not gonna be only bringing Arcane Barrier, they're gonna bring like Oasis probably. I know Olim's on Oasis just in terms of main board, and I think a lot of decks that are worried about Wizard that have the access to it are gonna opt to actually include Oasis. I think that card has made it really difficult for Kano. For that reason, I'm hovering between C and D. I think that Kano is still probably really playable, and I think that good Kano pilots will still do fine. But I think between Oasis, between some of the grindier decks that exist, I don't know, it's difficult. I think Dromite being really strong is going to give problems for Kano. I think Dash being arguably good is going to give problems for Kano. I don't know what the Icelander matchup is like, but I've heard it's Icelander favored. I think Oldhim being on Oasis just makes it hard for Kano to like pitch deck something that kills Oldhim. So I think that in terms of, and then also probably just gets blown out by Briar, unless if the Kano also high rolls at the same time. So in terms of like the top end of the meta, I think it looks hard for Kano. I really don't know exactly like where the angle he would hit would be, other than for some reason people don't bring AB, which is not going to happen because of Icelander, or Olim isn't playing Oasis, or Dash is not on an aggro plan. I think that the current meta is going to be hard for him, which is weird because Prism left, and I think while that matchup is more polarizing, I don't think he's increased in terms of strength. So Azalea is probably still down in D, has a lot of issues. Her weapon doesn't attack on its own. You're able to actually actively run out of threats the same way Lexi can, although your cards normally pressure less damage. Lexi's able to abuse things like Art of War as well as the disruptive nature of her ability. Also gaining Go Again, being able to load multiple arrows with Bolden Shot are all really strong. And it's a little bit unfortunate, but Azalea does need some pretty decent support. I'm probably not shocking anyone here. Azalea's in a rough spot. Viserai. So Viserai is an interesting one because traditionally he's been really good throughout the Everfest season. Arguably was one of the best decks, if not the best deck outside of Starvo. Good enough to get Scaletta banned. Card was crazy. But now with Prism gone, and Guardians resurfacing, Icelander resurfacing. I think he's in a tougher spot. I really do. There are ways that he can do evasive damage to the Guardians, which are really good. Of course, Rosetta Thorn is fantastic. Very, very strong card. But I don't think he can high roll to the same degree that Briar can. I think both of those Rune Blades, I would argue, are unfavored into this more ice control meta. The difference is that Briar can just still go crazy. Briar can still high roll CMH. And in Briar high roll CMH, there's only so much you can do as a Guardian player. I don't think Viscera really has that potential anymore now that Skelett is gone. There are some high roll turns that usually involve Mordred Tide, and you can leak a lot of damage, but I don't think that the deck can really close it out if neither player is pressured for time. If you're in a top 8 match, I think Oldhim is perfectly comfortable like full fatiguing Viscera, as opposed to even trying to race it or be disruptive. And it's kind of tough for Viscera at the moment. I'm not sure how the Icelander matchup is, but that would maybe make or break the deck. I do know it can work pretty well into Dromai. Something to keep in mind though is that I think if Viscera loses Thorn, if Prism Living Legends during the Nat season, I think he probably he definitely falls, from my understanding. Thorn is a really big reason behind it. It's also a good reason why he has game into a lot of decks. I think currently I'd maybe be comfortable putting Viscera in A for now until we make it further down the list. I think Oldhim is probably one of the better decks to be on for the season. I think that it lost a very polarizing matchup with Prism now leaving. It does have a hard time in the Dromai, but I think the Dromai matchup is still winnable to some degree. If you're on certain builds of Oldhim and certain things go your way, which is not something you could say about Prism, right? So if Oldhim has a chance to beat Dromai, that's already instantly better than Prism. So at that point, he only has good matchups into pretty much the rest of the meta. He's able to safely fatigue Rangers because they eventually run out of arrows and they literally can't attack anymore. With cards like Oasis, he's able to survive a lot of problems from Kano, which maybe could be a meta call, right? He just looks good into everything else, right? You can comfortably block Dory. He can aggro and disrupt the Brutes, because once you're in that matchup, you then just pivot to something more aggressive like Zealous or Rouse, and the Intimidates don't matter. Reinhardt deals 9 and you deal like something, you deal the same damage if not more back to them, except it has like a disruptive, as like a crush effect or something. So you just can't be on a full defensive plan in that, and you'll be fine. The only problem Oldhim might have is just in a dash, which we'll get to at some point. But right now he looks like probably one of the best decks to be on. And I think I would probably make your meta call based on expecting Oldhim and Runeblades. That's the general gist of where this is headed. I think Lexi is gonna have a lot of problems with Prism being gone. Ironically, a lot of decks that you would think got better because of Prism leaving, unfortunately, are still gated behind Guardians. They're normally decks that have tough Guardian matchups. I know there are ways that Lexi can get over Oldhim, but it's really tough. It's very difficult for Lexi. I think that she is able to hit a lot of the Rune Blades pretty hard, which is definitely going to keep her somewhat competitively viable for the foreseeable future, especially being able to hit decks like Fi as well. She also can do pretty well into Dash. So I think for those reasons, she has a pretty good spot, at least being like a solid B tier, like a tier 2. She also does really struggle into Dromai. So I think that looking at the more recent Battle Hardens, it doesn't look great for her. She of course would do great in the Pro Tour meta, but the Pro Tour meta is a little bit different now because of Prism leaving, so there is that. I think Briar is probably the best deck to be on. I even would maybe argue Briar's an S tier, but I think with the Guardians being where they are, I think she does have some problems, right? I think before Prism left, I think Briar would be an S tier. If we were looking at like the Pro Tour meta, because Briar Gate kept a lot of Guardians, but Briar had a really good Prism matchup, so the deck that's gatekeeping your bad matchup, you have a favored matchup into, I think you're only in a spot to win. But with Prism leaving, Guardians actually have game now, so I think that it pulls Briar down a little bit. Not significantly, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of Guardians win over the Nat season. I still think Briar is definitely going to living legend during the Nat season or Worlds. Personally, I think Briar is probably the deck to be on. She just has a lot of power in her cards. She's able to abuse things like Spellbound Creepers, able to abuse Channel Mount Heroic, and even through cards like that, you're able to beat your bad matchups because giving +3 to every single attack for 2 turns in a row, sometimes 3, in a Guardian, it doesn't matter if they block efficiently, they just get blown out immediately. Iyslander has no blocking armor outside of Coronet Peak and Tunic, sometimes Ironhide Gauntlet, and she only has 36 life, so it's much easier to high roll her. You're able to high roll all of your aggro matchups. You're able to abuse your embodiments as well. Runeblades once again have some of the best armor for some reason. It's crazy. Runeblades are just clearly like a much stronger class that do things better than everyone else, except for maybe being like a full fatigue list. Unless if you're playing against Dash, and then you are also the fatigue list as well. Iyslander I think is looking really good. I think once again it's pretty pilot dependent, but that shouldn't impact where something is in a tier list, right? Kano could be S tier, and I could still have the caveat that like, oh, you have to be good to win, by the way, right? But that doesn't change where it is. So I don't think there's like a tier where it's like, oh, if you're good with the hero, you win, right? Like, you know, we're assuming everyone's playing as optimally as possible when we look at these tier lists. So Iyslander's hard. She's a hard hero, but I think that she obviously looks really good into what we're seeing right now in the A tier, right? She can be old and pretty comfortably, and she is able to disrupt a lot of aggro strategies, including Fi and the Runeblades. You do have the ability to still lose sometimes, but she is pretty well positioned to be things like that. Prism no longer exists, so we don't have to worry about that gladly. I think Boltyn, maybe a little bit higher just because of the Guardian matchup. You're able to build up some crazy Luminous stuff, and Prism not existing anymore, that is a pretty good net positive for Boltyn. I think that he's probably fine. I don't know too much about Boltyn, but from my understanding, the Lumina combo version is pretty solid into a lot of decks. It's just an issue of them killing you or pressuring you before you're able to fully get the combo going. I know less about the Raiden builds, although I do know that those are naturally a little bit more aggressive. But assuming that, you know, we're putting him in the same list as Kano. Probably not going to win anything, but you're probably going to get some wins if you bring it to like a calling or something. I think Leviah, that's tough. I think I'm going to put her in D. I think she's going to have, well, no, actually, maybe we'll put her in C. I think she traditionally has a better Runeblade matchup because a lot of her cards are kind of overrate with the downside of the Blood Debt mechanic. You have Carrion Husk, and you also do have some pretty disruptive ways to hurt Guardians, assuming that the Guardians are trying to be disruptive into you as well. So I actually think that I would put Leviah higher than I would put Rhinar, just because the Guardians are on more aggressive plans now. Your Intimidates don't really affect their hands the same way, and you also have a really hard time racing Runeblades as Rhinar. But Leviah has the ability to actually race pretty hard, and she has more significant strategies into the Guardians, such as like recurring Howl from Beyond. I know very little about Leviah, by the way. I would like to make that abundantly clear. From my limited understanding, I think that Leviah is probably in a better spot than Rhinar, just because of the way that her card pool is kind of built. Now, of course, she has a massive downside of the Blood Debt mechanic, where you can just accidentally kill yourself to your own ability, and that's really tough, right? So that's why she's hanging out on C tier, is because of pretty much just that mechanic, honestly. Okay, so Dromai. The one thing I've learned is that no two Dromai players play alike or have the same deck, so I have no idea how to evaluate them. I'm starting to understand, we're starting to understand what the Dromai lists look like. We're starting to understand what her strengths are. She's very good in Iyslander. Iyslander cannot clear allies if she brings the Mai. Iyslander cannot even play things during her turn. It pretty much shuts out the deck entirely. Dromai can pivot into a mid-range deck, playing cards like Embermaw Centipies, even the Doomebreaker Centipies, having these really strong 2-card, 3-card hands, utilizing the 3-block on the invokes, and then also using the blocking strength of their armor. She's also able to benefit from actually being able to have a board state. Cards like Azulai, Chromai, sometimes Kyloria, but especially Yandarai are very difficult because they'll be attacking every single turn. Once you play them, you can comfortably full block with your hand and still throw damage back at your opponent, which actually starts to increase the rate of your hands. And it also requires damage from your opponent. So Azulai, as we like to joke, is a 0 for 6 because he deals 3 damage, but then also requires 3 damage from your opponent to kill it. Because of that, she can actually begin to grind out certain aggro matchups, especially into Runeblades and things like that. So if your Dromai pilot's pretty good and you just get a little bit lucky, I think you can sort of beat some otherwise kind of bad matchups. So she feels pretty comfortable as a mid-range hero, right? Doesn't have any completely unwinnable polarizing matchups. Doesn't really have any slam dunks either. I mean, Guardian and Icelander definitely feel very strongly favored for her, but there are still ways where she can lose, which is not something you could probably say about Prism. I still think she's arguably an A. You can maybe argue that she's in B tier. She feels really comfortable into everything in A, outside of maybe like Viscera and Briar. But as we get further in, I think it'll begin to make more sense. I think I would put her in A or maybe top of B tier. I think she can function really well in either of these. I think that I would expect to see more Dromai pop up at these larger scale events as more people become more skilled with the deck. Vi is in a tough spot because with Prism leaving, he loses an otherwise pretty strong matchup for him. And then also as Guardians become stronger, he now gains a harder matchup. I know there are other lists out there like the Kodachi Fi that are made to sort of prey on aggro metas because you're able to block with cards into like the rune blades and stuff like that and then still send damage back, often threatening to draw cards either from Snatch or from Massive Momentum. You also run like, I think pretty much like all the colors of Snatches. It's crazy. The downside of the Kodachi list is you're actually weaker to some of the more control matchups. So like Guardian, for instance, Oldhim will pretty much never take damage from your Kodachis, which is a huge problem and a big reason why Katsu just can't really exist right now. Bravo is able to grind down and still disrupt you, and Icelander can shut down a lot of your things as well. I think that Fi is probably a pretty good deck at the moment. I'm not sure if I would put it in the highest tier though. I think he probably would suffer into what a lot of the top meta is looking like. I think that's kind of reflected too in what we're seeing. We're not seeing Fi pop up as much in the top 8s, right? They're still making, top 32, but I wouldn't exactly put it in the A tier. Dorinthia, once again, is a hero that you think would get better with Prism leaving, but doesn't really move anywhere. Arguably maybe moves down. Guardians now come into effect. Icelander comes into effect with Prism leaving. And those are tough matchups for Dorinthia. So Dorinthia loses a bad matchup and gains more. So I actually would maybe argue that Dorinthia becomes worse with Prism leaving. Oldhim, Bravo, even arguably Icelander, all can play defense reactions, and those can come out of their arsenal. It's going to be very difficult for Dorinthia to do what she wants to do. In Icelander, she can be disrupted pretty well, especially trying to get to that second Dawnblade function only off a couple cards. I do know that some people say Dorinthia is actually pretty good in Icelander, so that may be true. I could be wrong here. From my experience, matchup has felt pretty even, but definitely Icelander favored. And of course, as the Guardians moving up is just a problem. Briar's a problem for everything in the meta just because she is so strong and she can high roll you to the point where you just can't do anything. Even though you have a fridge and stuff like that, I think it's pretty difficult. I would maybe put Dorinthia in the bottom of B. I think she can still prey on the aggro decks. I think she works really well into Dromai, of course, no surprise there. And I think that she still has the surprise element, much like Dash. So I would be comfortable putting her there, but do keep in mind the Guardians being in the meta does make it hard for her. I think Reinhardt is like, I wouldn't say Reinhardt's the worst deck. I think he's like in D. He can do pretty well in the Icelander. Disrupting her hand can actually cause issues for her, depending on what she wanted to block with, of course, because Icelander normally has an arsenal target in mind every single turn. So if you disrupt her hand, sometimes the only card she's left with is like the Frost Tech she wanted to block with, right? Or the Arctic Incarceration, the Channel Lake Frigid, and you leave her with like the Reds in hand. If she decides to respond early by pitching to play something out of Arsenal, you then intimidate the remaining cards, which makes it really difficult for her. So cards like Barrage and Beatdown, the same way they work into Kano, gonna work really well into her. You're able to pack AB3 fairly easily without really losing a whole lot, or even AB2 if you only want to go for that route. And you want to keep your glove piece, you can just go with Skullhorn. Your cards are normally yellows anyway. I think because of that, Reinhardt has a good time there, but he loses in the Rune Blades, and he arguably actually doesn't have that good of a time in a Guardian. Normally he's been positioned as like a Guardian killer, but that's like assuming they're on these full defense lists that like actively want to try to block him out. But I think at this point you're going to see Guardians position themselves into more aggressive game plans, which was already happening with Prism, but now definitely has to happen with decks like Icelander, Dromai, and Dash not existing. And personally for me, I've actually really struggled into the disruptive Oldhim game plans, right? Because if you're if you're basing your deck on like no block cheetah package style things, where you're playing like Pulpy and Wild Ride, Bare Fangs, and you're doing claws as well, the problem you'll run into is they'll play like Spinal Crush into you, and like 2 of your cards don't block, and then those 2 cards are red, so if you block with the remaining 2 cards and take 3 damage, you literally don't have a turn except to pitch 2 cards and swing like a Mandible Claw. I think runners can have a lot of problems in this meta. Dromai is good, but there are still issues considering that she can remove Phantasm from the dragons, especially if she chains it pretty well together. I think he's going to have like a hard time. He's also just going to completely crumble to decks like Phi. Has no way to block them out or erase them. I think he's like in a really bad spot, unfortunately. Bravo, I would put up here. I would probably put up here with Oldhim. They're just clearly going to prey on most of the meta. They have game into their bad matchup, which is Dromai and Icelander. They're pretty even. And so for that reason, like, he's comfortably going up with Oldhim. They can kind of work on different axes. Bravo can tend to be more aggressive. Oldhim can tend to be more, I guess, defensive, has more utility sometimes with cards like Channeling Frigid with the Earth and Ice reactability on the card. Bravo gains most of his utility through the crush effects in his card pool, but they're both like operating pretty much on the same game plan, which is to either like fully fatigue your opponent either through disruption, making you block with your good cards, or blocking your good cards, right? So they achieve that game plan through a variety of means, but they can grind out really efficiently. Their weapons are very powerful, and so once you get to the late game, you just eventually run out of threats, and then they're in a good spot because their weapon swings like crazy, right? Winter's Wail is phenomenal, and Nothos is phenomenal. They're great cards. Katsu's rough. Katsu's not in a good spot. Pretty much gets outpaced by most of the aggro decks that are in the meta. Has a hard time into Oldhim, just like can't even beat that matchup. It's very difficult. You might be able to do well in the Dromai, but I think Phi is probably just a better Kodachi ninja list at this point. Phi has much more explosive high ends, can still pivot to Assyrian Emberblade builds, which can actually get over Guardians, which is really surprising that there's an aggro deck that just like can outclass like the defenses of Guardians, especially Oldhim. I mean, it's not too surprising. I think Katsu's probably down in the C tier. I think he's probably the best C tier hero to have, but I just don't think he's super strong right now. Now we're at Dash. So here's the deal. I think Dromai goes up. I don't think there is an S tier deck this meta. I think everything is pretty even. The meta feels very nice and comfortable. It feels very skill expressive. A lot of decks are going to be operating on maybe like 60-40 matchups, 55-45 matchups. You're going to feel pretty tight with most of your games. It's going to mostly come down to a couple misplays either on your end or on your opponent's end, and that's probably going to dictate who wins and who loses. So when we look at this, we look at a pretty flat top end that's pretty comfortable. We're gauging this also with the knowledge of the Battle Hardens and the Pro Tour. We have to ask, like, where does Dash sit in all of this? I think Dash can do well into Rune Blades. I think Dash can beat Guardians, and I think that Dash can beat Dromai. However, like we said, as Dash becomes more popular, more people are going to find ways to beat her. You're going to find decks that are going to try to actively fatigue her. You're going to find decks that are actively trying to pressure her, such as the Guardians now pivoting to more aggressive game plans. And I think that's going to make it really hard for Dash. So I think Dash is in top of B tier. I think Dash could be in bottom of A. And it's not that it's because she has a hard time in the meta. She actually has a very good time in the meta. It's that she's going to lose a lot of her edge, right? I think after a while, I could even see Dromai and Dash swapping spots, where people then start to tech for Dromai, right? These are just like rogue mid-range heroes that are able to angle certain metas, and they're able to basically prey on some player inexperience, some gaps in player knowledge, but also just like the unknown factor of them, right? Like I said, every Dromai build feels different for some reason, right? And the same goes for Dash. There's a lot of different Dash builds out there now that people aren't familiar with if you're not like in this circle, right? You don't know what style of Dash the player's on. I think that if Briar leaves, I think Dash becomes very, very good. I think Dash will actually be able to probably go back to an old traditional mid-range build where you're able to play like a Race Face, CNC, Signal Jammer, that all you got. Because I mean, Viserai is going to fall. Viserai is going to fall hard. I don't know how hard, but he's going to fall, right? And all of a sudden, in a meta like that, like mid-range dash can actually probably shine. Even though Dromai probably comes back up, I think that you would probably land up with something like that, right? But until then, I think it probably looks something like this, or arguably something like this. Maybe we could even say they're all in A tier, right? That might be perfectly comfortable to say. Dash on with a good pilot into other good pilots, I think is going to be really close. I think it's close for all these. I feel like she has a very even spread. So here's the only thing. I'm going to go back to something I said earlier. A hero being on the top end means that they also don't have very well represented bad matchups. But when you look at the tier 2, Dash is going to have a problem into a lot of this. She's going to have a problem in Defy. She has problems in Alexi. She can't beat Dorinthia if she's on the hybrid build or even the mid-range build because you're able to bring in a lot of defensive reactions. But she also has a really hard time into Viscerai, right? So I think she's going to struggle here. And even when you get down to here, she's going to struggle into Katsu. She arguably might struggle into Brutes. I'm not entirely sure about what that matchup is like. But I think that she has a harder time as you get further down. But also so does Dromai. Dromai has a hard time once you get down to things like Phi and Dorinthia, Katsu arguably. But then she also has really good matchups down here too. Like she works very well into Lexi, who probably will also be popping up. So maybe we could even argue both of these should be here, possibly. But I think that they're putting up too good of results to ignore them. They're both showing up. You know, we have Dash in the top 8 of the Pro Tour, we have Dash in the top in the finals of the Battle Hardened in Columbus. But we also have 2 Dromais here, right? So I think maybe we can bump these both up here. And it's just going to be a really crazy open meta. At least open in terms of the A tier, right? Everything feels good. Nothing feels broken. If we were in the last meta, I think Briar would be a little bit higher, but I think she's being pulled down specifically by these Guardians existing. They're keeping most of these decks in check, especially below. But then they also have bad matchups like into the Illusionists and stuff. So that's kind of my overall thoughts. Going into Nats, I expect to see Briar Living Legend. I expect to see Guardians do very well. I expect rogue decks, especially the mid-range rogue decks like Dromai, Dash, and Ice Center to also perform pretty well. I don't really anticipate to see Kano have like a resurgence. I don't really anticipate to see Lexi angle shoot some metas. I think Dorinthia is kind of a hard time. I think you'll see these decks pop up in top 8. I wouldn't be surprised to see Phi win some, but I think that it would require probably a little bit of deck ingenuity. I think the traditionalists are gonna like probably have a difficult time. So thanks for watching. This was just something I wanted to talk about just because people asked me on my Patreon to give my thoughts about the meta with Prism leaving, so I thought it'd be important to quickly discuss, and this was not quick at all, so I'm totally sorry, but if you watched all this, thank you. Hope you have a good day.